In this lecture, we will introduce our course on the history of comics and anime by looking briefly at the history of newspapers, comic strips, and early animation. However, we will not begin with any of these things, but rather with a form of theater known as vaudeville. Basically, vaudeville was a series of stage acts featuring different types of performers, including musicians, dancers, and magicians, such as Harry Houdini. Moreover, vaudeville also featured comedians, such as the Marx Brothers. The humor in vaudeville was often marked by a dialogue between multiple characters, many of whom were either a bit thick-headed or eccentric, and who were usually placed in silly situations or in conflict with each other, leading to the comedy. That may sound a lot like comic strips, and there's a reason for that, as well as early animation. Now, vaudeville was popular throughout the United States, but the center was in New York, and it's no coincidence that New York was also one of the centers for the development of comic books and animation. New York was also a center for newspapers. Now, the history of newspapers in America begins in the early 18th century, but by the late 19th, early 20th century, newspapers had developed into large businesses. And while they might play key roles in exposing corruption or calling for moral crusades, they were also motivated by profit, and thus were always interested in ways of boosting circulation, say, for example, by having new, humorous, and innovative comic strips. And while newspapers might have different names based on locality, newspaper companies often owned multiple papers found all throughout the United States, often following the same editorial opinion, editorial perspective, and publishing the same types of articles, or including the same comic strips, as we shall see. Now, there could be morning and evening and special editions of newspapers, and the average American might read several newspapers a day. We have to remember that this is a time before the internet, before news was easily accessible, and so this was quite common. And even if you couldn't read, there would often be people reading them in public, so you could hear them. Now, I can tell you one thing. I was born in 1978. That was before the internet. And I remember that not only did my house get one newspaper, we actually got two newspapers. We got a morning newspaper and an evening newspaper. I'm from Indiana, so we got the Indianapolis newspapers. We got the Star in the morning and the News at night. And I loved it because it meant I got to read two sets of comic strips. Now, comics had had a long history in the United States, though they did lag behind in comparison to Europe. A lot of the things that we'll talk about being the first to happen in the United States had actually been done in Europe before. But that being said, there was a rich tradition of American comic art, as exemplified in the work of Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast is famous for standardizing our understanding of Uncle Sam. That character had already been developed. It's just Uncle Sam was kind of standardized by Nast. He came up with the ideal look of Uncle Sam. He did the same for Santa Claus. He did also come up with using the elephant to represent the Republican Party. The key thing, though, is that Nast and other cartoonists at this time focused primarily on politics. When they did use humor, it was principally used as political satire. Now, Thomas Nast and other cartoon artists during this time, and of course up through the period we're going to be looking through, would often reflect the best ideals and values that we had in society. As you can see in this political cartoon, Nast is expressing his hope that one day in the United States, all would be able to vote, regardless of race or gender, and be a part of American democracy. At the same time, Thomas Nast and comics in general, as any kind of popular culture, can reflect our prejudices. Here, Nast is depicting Catholicism, particularly the idea of Catholic schools, as posing an existential threat to the United States and to American children. Generally, Richard Alcott is given credit for creating the first modern American comic, The Yellow Kid. Richard Alcott was a technical artist who had worked for Thomas Edison, but at the same time did humor illustrations on the side. Now, in 1896, he would publish what is generally considered the first modern American comic strip of a character referred to as the Yellow Kid. Now, he had presented the Yellow Kid in other situations, in other comic situations. What's special here, though, is that he did a great job of dividing up the Yellow Kid's actions into separate kind of spaces in which he's entering into a dialogue, and thus captured the back and forth humor of vaudeville. Now, Europeans had done this previously, as had other Americans. So there's this question then, why is it that we consider this the first modern American comic when other people were using the same techniques. Well, notice I said American comic, so that kind of excludes Europeans. But the other key thing here is that this is what caught on. While other people had done this, it wasn't really noticed. It didn't really lead to further development. But from the Yellow Kid, and from this comic strip in particular, you can trace a kind of line of development of comics. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing here. Now, one thing I need to clear up, as I just mentioned previously, that there was oftentimes a tendency for comics to reflect prejudices within society, right? They're popular culture. They reflect that culture. And unfortunately, as we'll see, there was a good amount of racism. So with the name Yellow Kid, and with the appearance of the Yellow Kid as it is, you might be tempted to think that he was in fact Asian. However, he was not. He was actually Mickey Dugan, an Irish child. Now, what's interesting, and that brings up kind of its own stereotypes, ethnic stereotypes, is that the Yellow Kid was set in a place called Hogan's Alley, which was a urban area, and the Yellow Kid was not necessarily the nicest person, nor were his friends. They also tended to speak in poor English, and they tended to do bad things. This was so popular because the Yellow Kid, in a sense, was a satire on society and did things that we wouldn't normally expect to be allowed to do. And that's probably one thing that made him so popular. Now, here's the thing that also helped create a panic. Not so much about the Yellow Kid, I should point out, but about comic strips in general. And as they develop, there's going to be a fear among many people that comic strips are somehow harmful to young people, particularly their moral and intellectual development. But the key thing is you can't have a panic unless something is popular. The Yellow Kid and the comic strips that will follow will be very popular. Naturally speaking, they will increase the circulation of any newspaper that contains them. And as we can see here in this sheet music, they could also be licensed, and merchandise could be printed with their appearances on them, and that would drive up sales. So there's this kind of connection between the development of new forms of popular culture, capitalism, right? Popular culture has to make money, and moral panic, moral fear. And we'll see that again with comic books, especially in the early 1950s. The sheer amount of money that could be made from comic strips helped inspire a man named Bud Fisher to try and develop his own. Fisher has an interesting career path. He started off as a prize fighter, as a boxer, who then became an illustrator and worked as a sports illustrator for the San Francisco Chronicle. Moreover, he also had an avid interest in horse racing and gambled upon the horses. He wanted in on this action. He said, hey, I can make money doing this. I have the skills, and developed a comic strip called A Mutt in Sports Pages, which would soon, by the year 1907, become Mutt and Jeff. Fisher's work in Mutt and Jeff is marked by the introduction of clear panels, which was often in stark contrast to the chaos of the Yellow Kid. In addition, whereas the Yellow Kid was more limited initially in the newspapers where he appeared, Mutt and Jeff would be syndicated, allowing it to appear quickly in newspapers throughout the country. You may ask, what is syndication? Well, a syndicate is a company that distributes something, in this case comics, to various newspapers. So if you were picked up by a syndicate, if they liked your work, you could become quite wealthy because they would make sure that your comics could appear in hundreds of newspapers. In addition, Fisher had made sure that he had the copyright of his comic strip so that when he left the San Francisco Chronicle to work for King Features, which was a syndicate, right? San Francisco Chronicle was a single newspaper, so that would, of course, limit the amount of money he could make. But when he went to King Features, because he had made sure he had the copyright, he got to bring the comic strip with him. And it also meant the San Francisco Chronicle couldn't simply hire someone else to make it instead of him. This points to an important issue. Like I said, popular culture also is driven by business, right? That's how Fisher got into this in the first place. Whoever owned the characters could make a lot of money, and so there would be often fights over who owned them, or in some cases, who actually created them. Right? This is all about art, but it's also all about business too. This brings us then to Winsor McCay, who's especially important because he shows us clearly the connection between newspapers, comics, vaudeville, and animation. McCay was an artist working as a sign painter for what is called a dime museum in Cincinnati. These were museums that were aimed mostly at middle and lower class people. They only cost a dime for admission. And while they could have educational functions and were billed as that, we might consider them a kind of edutainment, right? It was something that sometimes kind of blurred the line and, in order to make money, aired more on the entertainment aspect. But in any case, he was an artist who made money trying to draw posters that would attract people into these dime museums. In addition, he was also a performer in vaudeville, and he was famous for doing kind of chalk stories. He would get up on a chalkboard, a very large chalkboard so people could see it, and then illustrate people, and then draw them aging, right? So within a few minutes, he would have a couple young people he would draw, and then age them using the chalk. Winsor McCay was a skilled illustrator and would work for the New York Herald. And in 1905, he would develop his comic strip and publish it called Little Nemo, also referred to as Adventures in Slumberland. And the idea is that you had this little kid who would have these amazing, fantastic dreams. And this strip here gives you kind of an understanding of how great Winsor McCay was as an artist and how he is experimenting with panels to help control the pacing and to give an impression of movement. So if you follow along, first of all, I want to note that the panels have numbers, right? They're numbered 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. That's to help the reader follow along. The right reader might not be familiar with the way panels work, but also because you have this kind of experimentation, it's felt necessary to guide the reader. But you can see the wonderful artwork, how Winsor McCay makes an inanimate object, a bed, have legs that seem to move. And you have this kind of jumping of the legs. And one thing I think is really striking, if you look at panels 13 and 14, you have the continuation of the background, right, from 13 or 14, right? If you were to remove the panel dividing line, it would just be one background. But the characters appear twice to give you a sense of how they're moving quickly through the background. And you can see in 14 that they're kind of tripping up. And in 15, they're falling out of bed, right, to the ground. And that fall brings your eye down to 16, where little Nemo has actually fallen out of bed in reality. So you can see the sense of just how skilled Winsor McCay is as an artist. I mean, this is intricately and beautifully drawn, but how he's really capturing movement throughout this. So I think this is just really striking and really gives us a sense of how quickly the comic art form is developing. Now, animation has been developing in parallel to the development of comic strips. So we're going to take a step back for a second. Though as we do, please remember the name of Winsor McCay. He has a foot in both worlds, and that's why I like to talk about him. But before we talk about animation, we also need to give some background. We have to recognize that the development of animation required technological advances, fairly complex ones. First, there had to be the development of inexpensive and quick photography. Right? Taking pictures is absolutely essential for animation. In addition, there had to be the development of cameras that could take many pictures in a row and store them on a reel of film, i.e. a movie camera. And then it was important to develop a way of viewing films once they had been taken, a kind of projector. And what I think is particularly striking is, and my French is terrible, but there were a couple French brothers, the Lumière brothers, which means light, which I think is very relevant and appropriate. But they not only developed a camera, they had a way that you could kind of reverse the camera so that you could change the camera into a projector. But those are kind of the three technological innovations we need to have. The ability to take photographs, the ability to take many photographs at a time, and then the ability to play those back. And that took a lot of technological innovation to be able to do that. Some regarded early movies as a simple novelty, as a fad that would pass. But thanks to the hard work of movie makers, their experimentation, especially with ideas of editing, new developments would allow for longer and more interesting movies. One early example of how editing allowed for animation is The Enchanted Drawing, which was produced in 1900 by James Blackton. Blackton's an interesting person. In terms of his job experience, he had worked as a reporter, and his journalistic career had also been an illustrator, so he understood how to draw. And he had even assisted a stage magician, showing the connection between art and performance in animation history. He had met Thomas Edison and been impressed with his early movies, and was so moved, in fact, that he established the American Victograph Company, which is what had produced The Enchanted Drawing. He would continue to develop and pioneer stop-action animation, as seen in his 1906 Humorous Phases of Funny Faces. And that brings us back to Winsor McCay. He also experimented with animation, animating Little Nemo in 1911. Now, as you watch the Little Nemo animation, you'll see that it doesn't really have much of a point. It's simple experimentation. But within just a few years, Winsor McCay would animate Gertie, which is basically the story of a trained dinosaur. Now, you may ask, why is Gertie so sad in this panel? Well, it's because Winsor McCay is no longer around to perform with her. When you watch this animation today, you watch it simply as an animation, and there's a dialogue between the dinosaur and the trainer, with the trainer appearing in the film at the last moment, in the last part of the film. What would have happened is, originally, this would have been projected onto a wall, and Winsor McCay himself would have interacted in it. This would have happened in a vaudeville hall. So again, we can see the connection between vaudeville, animation, and movies. And like I said, when you watch this animation, you have to pretend that Winsor McCay is standing off to the side, actually saying what's on the cards, right? There's cards that appear between the various animated shots, giving the dialogue. He would have actually spoken that during the vaudeville presentation. Now, Winsor McCay was an artist, essentially, and was interested in exploring animation as an artist and developing that art form. His contemporary John Bray was very different. He was much more interested in learning money. He focused on how to organize a studio, for example, delegating roles, whereas Winsor McCay had basically just done things himself, thus making it more like a factory, an assembly line for animation. He would go on to develop the first animation series, starting in 1913, with a cartoon called Colonel He's a Liar, which was loosely based on Teddy Roosevelt. You can kind of see the appearance, but the idea was it's this guy who tells these outlandish stories. Inspired by this, Mutt and Jeff would soon follow with their own animated series. There is a story about John Bray that can show us how conflict could easily arise, especially regarding this tension between business and art. When Bray was learning about animation, he pretended to be a journalist writing a story on that subject while Gertie was being produced, the animation about the dinosaur we just looked at. He went to speak to Winsor McCay, pretending to be a journalist, and McCay, an artist, a lover of animation, was quite happy to share his ideas. Bray then ran off and patented the various techniques that McCay had so willingly shared with him. And as McCay continued to use those techniques, Bray sued McCay for using those techniques. Even though McCay had developed them himself, Bray had the patent. Now, fortunately, justice was ultimately done in that McCay not only successfully defended himself in the lawsuit, but Bray was forced to pay McCay the royalties for the ideas he had stolen. But you can see here how easily, especially when there's people who are not particularly scrupulous, this kind of tension between the artistic and the business impulse could lead to conflict. We now here can talk about a significant problem in animation, and that was how to cost effectively make animation that looked real, that correctly and accurately mirrored how human bodies actually work and how they actually move. John Bray was able to animate relatively cheaply, but that animation was kind of clunky, did not really look smooth or accurate. While Winsor McCay's animation was quite good, it was also very difficult and very expensive to produce. So how do you make animation that looks good, that looks accurate, but is cost effective? A man named Waldemar Kempfert, the editor of Popular Science magazine, was upset at how bad animation looked and complained to his art director, a man by the name of Max Fleischer. This would lead Max Fleischer and his brother David Fleischer to develop a device called a rotoscope. This device worked like this. You would take a movie of an actual person moving, say dancing. Dave Fleischer would dress up as a clown, for example, and then would dance and cavort. Film them doing this, and then use the rotoscope to project the film so you could trace it. Then you would re-photograph those images, and you would have your animation. Through these means, the Fleischer brothers created the Out of the Inkwell series in 1919, starring Coco the Clown, who was able to move in a realistic fashion, much like a human being, because of course his movements were based on a human being, allowing for a relatively inexpensive way of creating animation that looked good.